A powerful billionaire prepares to close the biggest deal of his career aboard his luxurious yacht. On the way, he is approached by a poor girl who insists on giving him a warning impossible to ignore. She claims she heard men planning to throw him into the sea and brings proof that changes everything. What he discovers is shocking. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Stay with us. I promise this will be the best story you will ever hear. The morning sun glinted off the polished deck of the yacht moored at Marina del Rey, casting golden reflections across the water. Richard Hartwell adjusted his Italian silk tie as he strode down the pier, his leather shoes clicking against the weathered planks with the confident rhythm of a man who had conquered every obstacle life had thrown at him. At 52, he stood as living proof that the American dream was still alive. From sleeping in his beat-up Chevy as a teenager to building Hartwell Industries into a billion-dollar conglomerate, Richard had clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to spot opportunities where others saw only risk. Today was supposed to be the culmination of 15 years of strategic planning. Waiting aboard the Serendipity, his custom-built yacht, were 3 business partners ready to sign contracts that would expand Hartwell Industries into international markets. The deal would triple his company's value overnight, cementing his legacy as one of the most successful entrepreneurs in California history. His legal team had spent months reviewing every clause, every contingency. Everything was perfect. Almost. A small figure darted in front of him, nearly causing Richard to stumble. He caught himself, irritation flashing across his face as he prepared to brush past what he assumed was just another panhandler. Los Angeles had its share of street kids, and while Richard donated generously to homeless shelters, he had learned long ago that you couldn't save everyone personally. He had a meeting to attend, millions of dollars waiting to be signed into existence. But the girl didn't ask for money. She couldn't have been more than 11 or 12, with tangled brown hair and clothes that looked like they'd been stitched together from discarded fabric. Her face was smudged with dirt, and she clutched a plastic water bottle in one hand and a tattered notebook in the other. What struck Richard most were her eyes, sharp and intelligent, burning with an urgency that made him pause despite himself. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "you can't get on that boat." Richard blinked, taken aback that she knew his name. "Excuse me." "They're going to hurt you," she continued, stepping closer. "The men you're meeting. They're planning to throw you overboard and make it look like an accident. They want to take everything you've built." A laugh escaped Richard's throat before he could stop it. "That's quite an imagination you've got there, kid. Now if you'll excuse me." "I heard them." Her voice rose, desperate now. "2 nights ago, behind the seafood restaurant on Pier 43. I sleep there sometimes, in the alley where the dumpsters are. People don't see me. They talk like I'm invisible." Richard felt a prickle of unease, but pushed it aside. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I really need to—" "Thomas Brennan, Marcus Chen, and David Sullivan." She rattled off the names of his business partners with perfect accuracy. They met with 2 other men. One had a scar across his left eyebrow, the other wore a Navy anchor tattoo on his forearm. "They're hiding on your boat right now in the storage compartment below the main cabin." Richard froze. Those were indeed the names of his partners, information not exactly secret, but not something a random street kid would know. "How do you—" The girl thrust her notebook at him, pages fluttering open to reveal cramped handwriting, surprisingly neat given the circumstances. "I wrote everything down. Miss Patterson, she used to be a teacher before she lost her job. She lives in a shelter near the boardwalk and teaches us to read and write. She says knowledge is power, that we should pay attention to the world even if the world doesn't pay attention to us." Richard took the notebook, his hands suddenly unsteady. The pages contained detailed observations, physical descriptions, fragments of conversation, even a rough timeline. "They said they'd wait until you signed the papers," the girl explained, pointing to a specific entry. "The documents transfer control of your company to them. Once you sign, the 2 men will force you overboard. Mr. Brennan owes money to some very dangerous people. Mr. Chen's company went bankrupt last year and he's been hiding it. Mr. Sullivan's daughter needs an expensive medical treatment he can't afford. They're all desperate. The words hit Richard like physical blows. He knew Marcus had been struggling, had even offered to help, but Marcus had insisted everything was fine. And David's daughter Emily, had she been sick? David had taken several unexpected trips to Houston recently, claiming they were for business. As for Thomas, Richard had always sensed something predatory beneath his charming exterior, but had dismissed it as competitive drive. "Why are you telling me this?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl looked down at her worn sneakers. 6 months ago, it was raining really hard. I was trying to find somewhere dry to sleep, and I ended up in the doorway of your office building downtown. The security guard was about to chase me away, but you came out. You told him to let me stay until the storm passed. You even gave me your umbrella when you left. You probably don't remember. Richard didn't remember, but that sounded like something he might have done in a distracted moment of compassion. "That's it? That's why you're trying to save my life? You didn't look at me like I was trash," she said simply. "Most people do. You looked at me like I was a person." For a long moment, Richard stood there on the pier, the notebook heavy in his hands, his entire worldview shifting beneath his feet. He had built his empire on the principle of trusting his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming that this child was telling the truth. He pulled out his phone and dialed his head of security, a former FBI agent named Patricia Morrison. "Patricia, I need you at Marina del Rey immediately. Bring backup and contact the LAPD. I have reason to believe there's a credible threat aboard the Serendipity." 20 minutes later, the pier was swarming with police officers and security personnel. Richard had insisted the girl stay with him, and she stood close to his side, her thin frame trembling slightly, despite the warm California sun. Patricia had taken the notebook, photographed every page, and coordinated with the police to execute what she called a tactical intervention. The plan was simple. Richard would board the yacht as if nothing were amiss. He would greet his partners, sit down at the conference table, and begin reviewing the contracts. The moment any threat materialized, officers positioned around the marina would move in. Richard had argued against putting himself in danger, but Patricia had convinced him that they needed evidence of intent, not just the girl's testimony and some overheard conversations. As Richard climbed aboard the Serendipity, his heart hammered against his ribs. The main deck was immaculate, as always, with white leather seating and a polished teak table set up with leather portfolios containing the contracts. Thomas Brennan stood near the helm, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile as warm and false as ever. Marcus Chen was reviewing documents on his tablet, his expression tense. David Sullivan paced near the railing, and Richard noticed for the first time how haggard he looked, dark circles under his eyes, his suit hanging a bit looser than it should. "Richard!" Thomas called out, spreading his arms in welcome. "Right on time, as always. Shall we make history today?" "That's certainly the plan," Richard replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. He took his seat at the table, acutely aware of every sound, every movement. Somewhere below deck, 2 men were supposedly hiding, waiting for their moment. The conversation started normally enough, discussing market projections and expansion strategies. But Richard noticed the glances his partners exchanged, the way Thomas kept checking his watch, the nervous energy radiating from David. Marcus seemed to be avoiding eye contact altogether. Then Thomas slid a different set of documents across the table. "Before we finalize the international contracts, there's one small administrative matter. We need to restructure the corporate hierarchy to facilitate the expansion. Just a formality, really." Richard picked up the papers, scanning them with the practiced eye of someone who had reviewed thousands of contracts. What he saw made his blood run cold, buried in legal jargon. Was language that would effectively transfer controlling interest of Hartwell Industries to a newly formed partnership consisting of Thomas, Marcus, and David. He would be reduced to a minority shareholder in his own company. "This isn't what we discussed," Richard said carefully. "It's necessary for the international deal to proceed," Thomas insisted, his smile never wavering. "Surely you trust us, Richard. We've been partners for years." "Then you won't mind if I have my legal team review this first." Thomas's smile finally cracked. "I'm afraid we need your signature today. The international investors have a very narrow window. Then they'll have to wait. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the deck. David stopped pacing, his hand moving to his jacket pocket. And then, as if on cue, two men emerged from the stairway leading below deck. One had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, exactly as the girl had described. The other's forearm bore a navy anchor tattoo. "I really wish you'd just signed the papers, Richard," Thomas said, all pretense of friendliness gone. "This could have been clean, quick, an unfortunate accident at sea." The scarred man moved toward Richard, but before he could take more than 2 steps, the cabin doors burst open. Police officers flooded in from multiple entry points, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The 2 hired men froze, then slowly raised their hands. Thomas, Marcus, and David stood in shocked silence as officers moved to secure them. Patricia Morrison entered last, her expression grim but satisfied. "Richard Hartwell, you can step back now. We've got this." In the chaos that followed, as officers read rights and secured evidence, Richard learned the full scope of the conspiracy. Thomas had been orchestrating the plan for 8 months, exploiting Marcus's financial desperation and David's fear for his daughter's health. The 2 hired men were former associates of people Thomas owed money to, willing to commit violence in exchange for debt forgiveness. The plan had been meticulous. Once Richard signed the fraudulent documents and was gone, the 3 partners would express shock and grief, take control of the company, and use its resources to solve their individual crises. "Without that girl's warning, you'd be at the bottom of the Pacific right now," Patricia told Richard, as they watched the police lead the conspirators away in handcuffs. The coroner would have ruled it an accidental drowning. No one would have questioned it. Richard felt sick. He had built his company on the principle of giving people second chances, of seeing potential where others saw only failure. He had brought Thomas in when the man's previous venture had collapsed. He had invested in Marcus's ideas when other investors laughed him out of their offices. He had promoted David from an entry-level position to partner based purely on merit, and they had repaid his trust with betrayal. When Richard finally left the yacht, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The girl was still there, sitting on a bench near the pier, looking small and alone. When she saw him, she stood up quickly, as if ready to run. "Hey," Richard called out gently. "It's okay. You're not in trouble." She relaxed slightly but remained wary. "Did they really try to hurt you?" "They did. And you saved my life." Richard sat down on the bench, and after a moment, she sat beside him. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said quietly. "Sophie Mitchell." "Well, Sophie Mitchell, I owe you a debt I can never fully repay." "You're a very brave girl." Sophie shook her head. "I was scared the whole time. I thought maybe you wouldn't believe me. Most adults don't listen to kids like me." "I'm listening now," Richard said. "Tell me about yourself. How did you end up on the streets?" The story that emerged over the next hour broke Richard's heart. Sophie and her younger sister Emma had been placed in foster care after their mother struggled with addiction and their father left. The sisters had been separated when the system couldn't find a home willing to take both girls. Sophie had been placed with a family that seemed nice at first, but turned out to be only interested in the monthly stipend. When she complained about being mistreated, she was moved to a group home where conditions were even worse. 6 months ago, she had run away, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the certainty of misery. "Emma's in a facility in Sacramento," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I haven't seen her in almost 2 years. She's only 8 now. I don't even know if she remembers me." "What if I could help you find her?" Richard asked. "What if I could bring you 2 back together?" Sophie's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "You'd do that? Really?" "Really," Richard promised. "But first, let's get you something to eat. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Sophie couldn't remember, which told Richard everything he needed to know. They went to a nearby restaurant, where Sophie ate with the focused intensity of someone who never knew when the next meal might come. Richard made phone calls, arranging for a hotel room for the night, contacting child services, beginning the process of locating Emma. Over the following days, Richard threw himself into Sophie's case with the same determination he had once applied to building his business empire. He hired the best family law attorney in Los Angeles, a woman named Jennifer Caldwell who specialized in reunification cases. He also hired a private investigator, Robert Hayes, to track down Emma and gather information about her current situation. What they discovered was both encouraging and troubling. Emma was indeed in a group facility in Sacramento, physically healthy but emotionally withdrawn according to her case file. The good news was that she had no pending adoption proceedings. The challenging news was that the system was bureaucratic and slow, designed to protect children, but often failing them in practice. While the legal wheels turned, Richard focused on Sophie. He took her to a doctor for a complete checkup, relieved when the physician declared her malnourished and exhausted, but otherwise healthy. He bought her new clothes, not the cheap discount store items she was used to, but quality pieces that fit properly and made her feel, for the first time in years, like a normal kid. He enrolled her in a private tutoring program to catch up on the education she had missed, while surviving on the streets. Sophie was hesitant at first, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Richard to reveal this was all temporary or conditional. But as days turned into weeks, she began to trust that maybe, just maybe, her life was actually changing. The breakthrough came 5 weeks after the incident on the yacht. Robert Hayes called Richard with news. He had located Emma and confirmed her status. More importantly, he had discovered that the facility where Emma was staying had a history of violations and was under investigation. This information, combined with Jennifer Caldwell's aggressive legal strategy, created an opening. "We can petition for emergency removal based on the facility's status," Jennifer explained during a conference call. "And given your resources and Sophie's testimony about wanting to be reunited with her sister, we have a strong case for placing Emma in your temporary custody while we work toward a more permanent solution." "How long will it take?" Richard asked. "If we move fast and the judge is sympathetic, we could have Emma here within 2 weeks." Richard looked at Sophie, who was listening to every word with barely contained hope. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it takes." 12 days later, Richard and Sophie drove to Sacramento in Richard's Mercedes, the back seat loaded with stuffed animals, books, and toys. Sophie had barely slept the night before, too excited and nervous about seeing her sister again. She had changed so much in just over a month, her face fuller, her eyes brighter, her clothes clean and new. But she worried that Emma wouldn't recognize her, or worse, wouldn't want to come with them. The facility was a grim concrete building in a rundown part of the city, surrounded by chain-link fencing. Richard felt anger rising in his chest, that any child had to live in such a place, but he pushed it down. Today was about reunion, not recrimination. A social worker led them to a common room where Emma sat at a small table, coloring with broken crayons. She was tiny for 8 years old, with the same brown hair as Sophie but cut short and uneven, as if someone had trimmed it without much care. When she looked up and saw Sophie, her eyes went wide. "Sophie!" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Emma!" Sophie rushed forward, and the two sisters collided in a hug. That made Richard's eyes sting with tears. They clung to each other, both crying, both talking at once, 2 years of separation dissolving in an instant of pure love. Richard stood back, giving them space, watching as Emma's social worker wiped her own eyes. "I've been doing this job for 15 years, the woman said quietly. "You never get used to seeing siblings separated, and you never stop celebrating when they're reunited." The drive back to Los Angeles was filled with chatter as Sophie and Emma caught up, their voices overlapping in their eagerness to share everything. Emma was shy, around Richard at first, but Sophie's obvious trust in him helped her relax. By the time they stopped for dinner at a family restaurant off the highway, Emma was holding Richard's hand as they walked to their table. That night, in the guest room of Richard's Malibu home that he had hastily converted into a bedroom for 2 girls, Sophie and Emma fell asleep in the same bed, their hands clasped together. Richard stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them, feeling something shift fundamentally in his chest. He had spent 30 years building a business empire, accumulating, wealth and power and influence. He had been proud of what he had accomplished, the jobs he had created, the innovations he had brought to market. But standing there, watching two little girls sleep peacefully for perhaps the first time in years, Richard realized that nothing he had ever built mattered as much as this moment. The next morning, over pancakes that Richard burned slightly because he had never actually cooked breakfast before, he made a decision. "Girls," he said, "I want to talk to you about something important." Sophie and Emma looked up from their plates, suddenly wary. Richard realized they were bracing for bad news, for the announcement that this was temporary, that they would be separated again. "I want to adopt you," he said simply. "Both of you. I want to be your father, permanently, if that's something you'd want." The silence that followed felt eternal. Then Emma burst into tears, and Sophie wasn't far behind. But they were happy tears, Richard realized with relief, as both girls launched themselves at him, nearly knocking him over with the force of their hug. "Is that a yes?" he asked, laughing. "Yes!" they shouted in unison. The adoption process was complex and lengthy, but Richard had resources and determination on his side. Jennifer Caldwell navigated the legal system with skill, building a case that demonstrated Richard's fitness as a parent and the girls' desperate need for stability and love. There were home visits and psychological evaluations and mountains of paperwork. There were moments of frustration when bureaucracy seemed designed to prevent rather than facilitate happy endings. But there were also moments of pure joy. Teaching Emma to swim in his pool, helping Sophie with her math homework and discovering she had a natural aptitude for numbers. Taking both girls to Disneyland and watching their faces light up with wonder. Reading bedtime stories and tucking them in, and hearing them call him Dad for the first time, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. 6 months after that fateful morning on the pier, Richard stood in a courtroom with Sophie on his left and Emma on his right, their hands clasped tightly in his. Judge Maria Santos reviewed the final documents, then looked up with a warm smile. "Mr. Hartwell, I've reviewed your petition thoroughly. I've read the reports from the social workers, the psychologists, and the character witnesses. I've spoken with Sophie and Emma privately, and I'm pleased to grant this adoption. Congratulations, you're officially a father." The gavel came down, and Richard's new family was born. The first few months of their new life together were a beautiful chaos. Richard had always been organized, his days structured around meetings and strategic planning sessions. Now his calendar included parent-teacher conferences, pediatrician appointments, and something called Spirit Week at the girls' new school. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals with Fortune 500 companies, but nothing had prepared him for the complexity of braiding hair or the diplomatic skills required to mediate, an argument over whose turn it was to choose the movie for family night. But Richard discovered something unexpected. He loved it, every chaotic, exhausting, wonderful moment of it. He loved the way Emma would climb into his lap while he worked from home, content to color quietly while he reviewed reports. He loved how Sophie would pepper him with questions about business and economics, her sharp mind already grasping concepts that took most adults years to understand. The girls were thriving. Emma, who had been withdrawn and quiet at the Sacramento facility, blossomed into a cheerful, creative child. She filled notebooks with drawings and stories, her imagination running wild now that she felt safe enough to dream. Sophie threw herself into her studies with fierce determination, as if making up for lost time. Her teachers reported that she was performing at grade level in most subjects and above grade level in mathematics. But healing from trauma was not a straight line, and Richard learned that lesson the hard way. 3 months into the adoption, Richard hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb to help track down some business intelligence on a potential acquisition. Marcus came highly recommended, with an impressive resume. Richard trusted him with sensitive information about Hartwell Industries' expansion plans, never suspecting that trust would be betrayed. It was Patricia Morrison, his head of security, who discovered the breach. She called Richard late one evening, her voice tight with anger. "We have a problem. Marcus Webb has been selling information about your company to Donovan Enterprises." Richard felt his stomach drop. Donovan Enterprises was his biggest competitor, led by James Donovan, a ruthless businessman who had been trying to undermine Hartwell Industries for years. Are you certain? I have emails, phone records, and bank transfers. He's been feeding them details about your acquisition targets, your pricing strategies, everything. The betrayal stung, especially coming so soon after the conspiracy on the yacht. Fire him, Richard said flatly, and make sure everyone knows why. That night, after the girls were asleep, he sat in his study, staring at the city lights spread out below his Malibu home, wondering if he was losing his ability to judge character. Sophie found him there an hour later, padding into the study in her pajamas. "Dad, are you okay?" Richard forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about work stuff." But Sophie was perceptive, one of the survival skills she had developed on the streets. "Someone hurt you again, didn't they, like those men on the boat?" Richard sighed. "Someone I trusted was sharing company secrets with a competitor. It's handled now. But yes, it hurt." "I'm sorry," Sophie said quietly. "People can be really awful sometimes." "They can," Richard agreed, "but they can also be amazing, like a brave girl who risked everything to warn a stranger about danger." Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, "Miss Patterson, the teacher who lives in the shelter, she used to tell us that you can't let bad people make you stop trusting good people. She said that's how they win, by making you hard and mean like them." Richard looked at his daughter, this wise, wounded child who had survived horrors he could barely imagine. "Miss Patterson sounds like a very smart woman." "She is," Sophie said. "Can we help her?" And just like that, Richard had his answer. The next day, he tracked down Eleanor Patterson, who had been a high school English teacher for 20 years before budget cuts eliminated her position. Richard offered her a job on the spot, creating a new position at Hartwell Industries, Director of Community Education Programs. Her role would be to develop initiatives that provided educational opportunities to underserved youth. But the real test of parenthood came on a Saturday afternoon at the Westfield Century City Mall. Richard had taken the girls shopping for new school clothes. Emma was happily clutching a bag containing a new art set. Sophie had been quieter than usual, and Richard had noticed her lingering near the toy section, staring at a small stuffed elephant with unusual intensity. They were heading toward the exit when a security guard approached them. "Excuse me, sir, but I need to speak with you about your daughter." Richard's protective instincts flared immediately. "What's this about?" "I'm afraid she was observed taking an item from the toy store without paying for it." Richard looked at Sophie, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. In her jacket pocket he could see the edge of something grey and fuzzy. The stuffed elephant. The security guard showed Richard the surveillance footage. It clearly showed Sophie glancing around, then quickly stuffing the elephant into her pocket before walking away. The guard was kind about it. "It's a $15 toy. If you pay for it now, we can forget this happened." Richard paid for the elephant and took both girls home, his mind racing. That evening, after Emma was in bed, Richard sat down with Sophie in the living room. She had been crying, and she looked at him with an expression that broke his heart. She was waiting for him to send her away. "Sophie," Richard said gently, "I need you to help me understand what happened today." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know why I did it. I just saw the elephant and I wanted it and I took it, like I used to do when I was on the streets. I know it was wrong. I know you would have bought it for me if I asked." Richard moved to sit beside her on the couch, putting his arm around her shoulders. "Your brain learned to survive in that environment. It learned that you had to take what you needed, because no one was going to give it to you. That was smart, Sophie. That kept you alive. But now you're safe, you're home, and your brain needs time to learn new patterns." "But what if I can't unlearn it?" Sophie asked, her voice breaking. "What if I mess up so bad that you don't want me anymore?" Richard pulled her close. "Sophie, listen to me very carefully. You are my daughter. That's not conditional on you being perfect or never making mistakes. I chose you and I choose you every single day. Nothing you do is going to make me stop being your father. Do you understand?" Sophie clung to him, and Richard held her until her tears subsided. It was a turning point, Not because the problem was solved, but because Sophie now understood that she could make mistakes and still be loved, still be wanted, still belong. The years that followed were full of the ordinary magic of family life. There were school plays where Emma forgot her lines but improvised brilliantly. There were science fairs where Sophie's projects on economic theory confused the judges but impressed the university professors Richard invited to attend. There were family vacations to national parks and lazy Sunday mornings making pancakes together. Sophie's interest in law grew stronger as she got older. She devoured books about the justice system, about children's rights, about the failures and successes of foster care. By the time she was applying to colleges, her essay about being saved by a businessman and wanting to save other children in return had admissions officers in tears. She was accepted to Stanford Law School with a full scholarship. Emma's artistic talent blossomed in unexpected ways. She wasn't just a skilled artist, she had a gift for teaching, for seeing potential in others and helping them develop it. She started volunteering at community centers, teaching art classes to underprivileged kids. She attended UCLA, majoring in art education, and graduated with honors. Richard, meanwhile, had undergone his own transformation. The near-death experience on the yacht and the journey of becoming a father had fundamentally changed his priorities. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Hartwell Industries, appointing a trusted CEO and moving into a chairman role that gave him more time for what really mattered, his family. But he couldn't ignore the knowledge that there were thousands of children like Sophie and Emma out there, lost in a system that was supposed to protect them, but often failed. So Richard did what he did best. He built something. The Hartwell Foundation for Children started with a mission to connect vulnerable children with permanent, loving families. Richard poured his resources and his passion into it, hiring social workers, family therapists, and legal advocates. Eleanor Patterson became the foundation's director of education. Sophie, during her law school years, interned with the foundation's legal team. Emma designed art therapy programs that helped traumatized children express emotions they didn't have words for. The foundation grew beyond anyone's expectations. Within 5 years, it had helped place over 1,000 children in permanent homes. Within 10 years, it had expanded to operate in 15 states, becoming a national model for child welfare reform. 20 years after that morning on the pier, Richard stood in a Los Angeles hotel ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of people celebrating the foundation's anniversary. He was 72 now, his hair completely silver, but his eyes still sharp and bright. Sophie stood at the podium, now a renowned children's rights attorney. "My sister Emma and I were two of the lucky ones," she was saying. "We found our way to a man who saw us not as problems to be solved, but as people worthy of love." Emma joined her sister on stage, and together they unveiled the foundation's newest initiative, a network of art schools in underserved communities, providing free classes to any child who wanted to learn. Later, Richard sat with his daughters and their families. Sophie's wife, Maria, was a social worker. Emma's husband, James, was an art teacher, and surrounding them were 5 grandchildren, all of them loved, all of them safe, all of them proof that broken things could be mended. "Dad," Sophie said, raising her glass, "Emma and I want to make a toast to the man who taught us that family isn't about where you come from, but about who chooses to stay." Richard clinked his glass against theirs, too emotional to speak. He thought about that morning 20 years ago, when he had been so focused on a business deal. He thought about the conspiracy that would have ended his life, if not for a child's courage. The greatest irony, Richard reflected, was that he had spent the first 50 years of his life building an empire, only to discover that none of it mattered compared to the simple act of being a father. Sophie and Emma, and the thousands of children helped by the foundation they had, inspired, that was a legacy that would outlive him by generations. A child who had been invisible to the world had saved his life, and in return, he had given her and her sister the one thing every child deserved: someone who would never stop fighting for them, never stop believing in them, never stop choosing them. As the evening wound down, Richard gathered his family close for a photograph. The camera flashed, capturing a moment of pure joy. 3 generations bound not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by the simple decision of a girl on a pier who had seen danger and decided to speak up, and a man who had decided to listen.